Hello. So today we'd like to be our second presentation for our country of expertise. Our interest is Sudan, and this is a very interesting case because of recent events in 2019 and now in 2020. There seems to be a democratic transition, but we'll see how that goes, even though there's some political problems um, due to not only the colonial period, but corruption in Omar Bashir's rule starting in 1989. So let's share the screen here. Okay. So Sudan is kind of a nation in waiting. That's why I decided to title it this way. Let's see, yeah, sound design. Okay. So the Democratic Republic of Sudan, as it's called, is the largest but least known of the Middle East and North African countries, which is very interesting. Its size and substantial economic potential have been obscured by endless conflicts in the region as a whole. But in 2020, Sudan's moral and democratic achievements have been brought to light in the aftermath of Omar Bashir's overthrow in 2009, such as, say, there was legislation, I think, a month ago or 2 months ago, I can't remember, of child marriage ending. There's been some progress on LGBTQ rights and so on, and there has been some negotiation between civilian and military rule, and we'll discuss that later on in the presentation. So Mr. Bashir, as I mentioned, has ruled since 1989, but it was a massive street protest that disrupted his very rule. Kind of a late Arab Spring. You wouldn't expect something to happen after the 2011-2012 period in the region, but it did in Sudan, and as we mentioned before, in Algeria. That's why these are two kind of unique cases of street protests happening very late, not in the 2011 period of Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, so on and so forth. So at the time of the Turco-Egyptian conquest, Sudan was divided into several small Muslim states, and a number of tribal territories where primitive communal, economic, and social relations ultimately prevailed. And we'll discuss how there has been disruptions. So the conquest was extremely brutal, and it exacted a heavy toll from the people and tribes of Sudan. The impact of Turco-Egyptian colonial rule on Sudan was simply disastrous, as the subsistence economy was distorted, as whole regions were depopulated, and slave raids were prominent. In addition to entrenching a foreign group of exploiters within the Sudan, colonial rule fragmented existing agricultural or pastoral communities and created new groups of privileged and oppressed in urban and rural areas alike. In 1881 through 1898, Sudan saw a rise of nationalism in the Mahdiya, which we will discuss. At this time, British creditors had imposed economic restrictions on Egypt in the late 1870s, and this thereby weakened Turco-Egyptian control of the Sudan, and we see how the Sudanese begin to break free from this domination later. In 1880 to 1882, the small military garrisons were reduced in size, and several military units were disbanded, even as taxation had increased. In 1881, a popular uprising led by the religious political movement Mahdist movement, which I discussed earlier, threw off Turco-Egyptian rule. Then, in a series of raids and battles in 18... Just one sec. Okay, I'm just making sure everything's okay. So in 1881, a popular uprising led by the religious political movement Mahdist movement threw off Turco-Egyptian rule. Then, in a series of raids and battles in 1881 through 1884, the Mahdist forces captured almost all the Egyptian garrisons and smashed the Turco-Egyptian forces. The Mahdists were supported by peasants, nomads, slaves, and artisans who formed guerrilla detachments which attacked government posts and tax collectors alike. The rise of the Mahdist movement created the initial basis for relentless political and economic conflict between the two major Sudanese tariqas, which are certain kind of religious brotherhoods. And this colors much of the subsequent Sudanese colonial and post-colonial history that we know of, and we'll discuss further. The end of the 18th century saw a revival of Islam and the growth of tariqas, which usually developed as a cult around a religious leader who also had economic functions in the local communities. This is very interesting. The Mahdiist state, throughout its short life, was persistently attacked and provoked by external enemies on all sides, and this Mahdiist idea or state kind of decays later on. It fought the Turco-Egyptian army in 1885 and again in 1891 along the Red Sea coast, the Ethiopians and the Darfur Sultan between 1887 and 1889, or through 1889, rebellions in Kordofan and Darfur in 1891. The British supported Italians from Ethiopia in 1893 to 94, and the Belgians in the southern region in 1894. So there's a lot of colonial powers fighting the Mahdis. Sudan became the focus for British and French forces racing to control the interior regions of Africa bordering on their colonies like Egypt. By 1896, the British and French government both dispatched expeditions to seize control of the Nile headwaters. And the Nile is a very important strategic river today and in the pre-colonial period, as there's a lot of conflicts between Sudan, Ethiopia, Egypt about it over the new Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. So the Nile has always been significant and strategic on the African continent. So why did the British come in? Following the occupation of Egypt in 1881, the British opposed the Egyptian request to mount a military campaign to regain control of Sudan, not wanting Egypt to incur expenses that would endanger repayment of debts to European financiers. The British decision in 1895 to conquer Sudan with Egyptian troops and financing reflected the British need to consolidate colonial control and prevent advances by other powers that would endanger their investments in Africa, including Egypt. After this, the British began demolishing framework with Sudanese societies. The British continued to implement direct administration and discontinued educational expansion in over Sudan. This is a common theme again in the colonial period in Africa, and it causes certain societal, social cohesion decay, political decay, economic fragmentation, cultural fragmentation. It's a bad disruption for the continent in a lot of ways. Schools were downgraded, and the little money in the colonial budget for education went almost solely to missionary schools in the South. And I wish we had time to discuss more about the fraction between North and South Sudan, but let's just focus on what is known today as North Sudan, but was back then Sudan. So it's complicated. During the 1930s, nationalist elements formed study groups in Khartoum, and this is a lot later, in Khartoum and Durman to discuss cultural and literary approaches to gaining Sudanese independence. So this is kind of when there's a rebellion, as there was in Egypt, so on and so forth, to break away from the British. And there was in Algeria, as we discussed earlier, through books and culture, and so on and so forth. So cultural and literary societies, as in other colonial societies, flourished as avenues of legal, political expressions, and nationalistic poems frequently found their way into daily newspapers in northern cities. Afterwards, in the mid-1940s, the small but strategically placed Sudanese working class began to express itself politically for the first time, and it almost solely made up of transport and the communication workers. And there is a political party, and it's alive today, of Sudanese communists, and there's a lot of socialism that later in the 60s and 70s, parties, people who believe in the pan-Arabism and not just socialist vision for the state, if it can be characterized that way. It gained some traction in the Sudan in the 60s and 70s. And the British, fearing the development of an independent trade union in the 1940s, sponsored a work committee that focused on improving productivity rather than wage demands. The British hoped to create a carefully controlled workers' movement concerned only with limited economic, not political issues. And they were worried about their authority, that's why. And they hoped that such a movement would not oppose their neo-colonial control in the eventuality of independence, because independence is not a matter of if, but when. So in the post-colonial period in Sudanese history, the country saw a mixture of civilian and military rule, 1956 and 1964. This, I don't know how much of a common theme it is, So during the first 3 years of Sudanese independence, declining cotton prices on the world market revealed the vulnerability of Sudanese dependence on a monocultural economy to external market pressure. The dominant political paradigm at the time was what form Sudanese independence will take. The Ummah supported independence within some form of the British Commonwealth, while others took different approaches. The NUP backed Sudanese self-rule as part of a Sudanese Egyptian Federation, which was a thing. The British sought to delay self-rule long enough to allow them to influence the structure of post-colonial institutions to preserve their own economic interests. That's a common theme with British colonialism. It's like there will be a post-colonial period, but we want to preserve our economic interests in whatever country we're colonizing in the African continent. Only the Ansar and the Ummah participated in the new British-sponsored representative bodies set up to plan gradual steps towards self-rule. So again, the British want to lay the framework for self-rule. The Ashika and NUP boycotted these bodies until after July 1952, when the Egyptian Revolution put an end to Anglo-Egyptian maneuvering and catalyzed a speedy agreement between Egyptian and Sudanese political groups on Sudan's right to self-rule. So there is also the Egyptian aspect of all this, and what their influence was in Sudanese independence. In Darfur, Southern Kordofan, and Blue Nile, these movements not only currently demanding equal citizenship rights today, but they are also demanding recognition of special rights, including claims to land, autonomous government, and the maintenance of ethno-national identities, thus opening up a debate about what citizenship entails, particularly in a multicultural context, how the current state reconciles competing claims of citizenship, and what kinds of viable institutional mechanisms are required for an effective relationship between the state, its citizen, and local power structures. Similar to many former European colonies in Africa, the official history of Sudan has been written mainly by Europeans. In this European colonial discourse theorized that African history, unlike European history, was a product of external influences. The histories and identities of African societies were imagined and represented in opposition of those of Europe. The rich pre-colonial social and political histories of African communities were either ignored or misrepresented as prehistoric vestiges of darkness. And we discussed this in Peter Schroeder's book, and we discussed this in a lecture, and it has a lot to do with how we look at Africa in the pre-colonial and post-colonial framework. Medieval Arab writers and later Europeans shared the same perspective about the history of Africa and Sudan, which we will discuss. So both of these entities presented the peoples of Sudan as comprising two different racial, cultural, historical, and regional categories, which, as we said, Africa is diverse, but maybe these arguments aren't viable. People of northern Sudan had been seen as Oriental, closer to the Egyptians, while people of southern Sudan had been presented as people without history. Northern Sudans were deemed Arab, Muslim, and civilized, whereas southern Sudan were considered black, heathen, and primitive. These geographical, racial, and cultural identities were, however, products of historical processes, namely slavery and colonialism. So then we see the influence of these ideas. The reality on the ground is that it does not make sense to take the North, South, or African Arab dichotomies as our units of analysis for studying the vast and diverse country of Sudan. I agree. Neither the people of the North nor those of the South constitute a distinct cultural and racial group with a distinct history can be taken as an objective of inquiry. And then, like the Nubians are different than other native Sudanese, so on and so forth. These racial and this is something we need to keep in mind when studying Africa. As we mentioned, that it's a diverse, vast country, and we need nuance. And Sudan is one of those countries where you need nuance, as there's a diversity. These racial and ethnic identities are political ones produced through the specific discourses and practices. Scholarship on Sudan has simply accepted the North and the South as fundamentally distinct, absolute, and different from each other. The scholarship claims that the northern region possesses a degree of cultural and political unity marked by the Islamic religion and Arab race. Yet many ethnic groups in northern Sudan, including the Fur and the Nuba in the west and the Beja in the east, were only marginally influenced by Arabization and Islamization. The Nubians, though Arabized, retain their language. This ethnic and religious diversity is not only unique to Sudan, it's applicable to the African continent as a whole, as I mentioned. So let's discuss current day Sudan. As we discussed the geographic feature, the racial components, the cultural components, the colonial components. So let's talk about it today. Current day Sudan is ripe with democratic potential, as I mentioned earlier. And even its Freedom House score, I think, went to 7 to something like 12, which is somewhat of an achievement. The military leaders and civilian protests who ousted the aggressive regime of Omar Bashir, which we talked about briefly, and his National Congress Party, also known as the NCP, in 2019, are uneasy partners in a transnational government that, if successful, will be replaced by an elected government in 2020 or 2022, I think. Civic space is slowly opening to individual and opposition parties, but security personnel associated with abuses of the old regime remain influential. This is a common theme in African politics. And their commitment to political freedoms and civil liberties remains sketchy at best. Mr. al-Bashir has played a crucial role in the history of contemporary Sudan. He's negatively affected it in a lot of ways. He came to power in a coup d'etat in 1989, was overthrown by the military in April, and after a protest movement beginning in December 2018, placed growing pressure on the government. And a lot of this was led by youth activists. The military initially attempted to rule without the input of civilian protesters who originally demonstrated against commodity prices and pervasive economic hardships, calling for Mr. al-Bashir's resignation. And we all know this famous massacre last summer, 2019. Security forces killed 127 protesters in the capital of Khartoum in June, sparking a backlash that forced the short-lived junta to include civilian leaders in a new transnational government as part of a power-sharing agreement reached in August. Many of Sudan's problems with democratization are by and large due to Mr. al-Bashir and his party. The electoral process is almost non-existent, and political institutions are malnourished and weak in their infancy, which is a common theme in African politics. There's a concerning lack of political pluralism and participation in Africa now and in Sudan. Our government is not efficient nor functioning, and Mr. al-Bashir and his party are by and large to blame for this. Successive governments in Sudan have neglected populations living in the periphery of the country, and the current day transitional government of Sudan is making progress on human rights and democracy, but there is still much to do. So it'll be very interesting to see how Sudan and Algeria evolve, and they're two very interesting cases with a very interesting experience and unique in their own way. So that is all for today, and those are my two countries. Thank you very much.